In 1996, a car silently glided through the streets of Detroit, carrying within its chassis a secret that powerful men would kill to protect. The vehicle made no sound, emitted no exhaust, and its driver smiled knowing that the future of transportation sat beneath his feet. 3 weeks later, that driver vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only whispers, classified documents, and a prototype that certain corporations would spend millions to acquire and destroy. This is not fiction. This is not conspiracy theory conjecture. This is the documented, verified, and systematically suppressed story of a man whose invention threatened to dismantle a $100 billion industry overnight. Picture yourself filling your gas tank tomorrow morning, watching the numbers climb past $50, $60, $70. Now imagine a world where that ritual never existed, where your vehicle ran on technology so advanced, so clean, and so efficient that oil companies would become relics of a primitive past. That world almost became our reality, and the man who nearly delivered it paid with everything he had. The automobile industry operates on principles established over a century ago, principles that generate astronomical profits for a select few, while the rest of humanity remains shackled to fossil fuel dependency. When someone threatens to shatter those chains, the response from entrenched powers follows predictable patterns of suppression, discreditation, and when necessary, elimination. The evidence trail leads through corporate boardrooms, government agencies, and shadowy meetings where the fate of revolutionary technology gets decided by men who never face public accountability. What you are about to hear will fundamentally alter your understanding of technological progress and the invisible forces that determine which innovations reach the masses and which get buried in unmarked graves.
The man at the center of this story possessed credentials beyond reproach, patents that validated his genius, and a working prototype that demonstrated his claims were not empty promises. Yet today, almost nobody knows his name. Ask yourself why that erasure occurred, and more importantly, who benefited from his silence. The answer will disturb you.
The year was 1991 when Jonathan Marlowe first conceived the propulsion system that would eventually make him both famous and hunted. Working from a modest laboratory in suburban Arizona, this former aerospace engineer had stumbled upon principles of electromagnetic conversion that defied conventional understanding of energy transfer. His background included 15 years at major defense contractors, multiple security clearances, and intimate knowledge of technologies the public would not see for decades. Marlowe possessed the rare combination of theoretical brilliance and practical engineering skill that transforms abstract concepts into functioning machinery. His obsession began innocently enough, a weekend project to improve electric vehicle efficiency that spiraled into something far more significant. What Marlowe discovered during those late nights contradicted established physics textbooks and promised to revolutionize not just transportation, but humanity's entire relationship with energy consumption. The prototype he eventually constructed resembled an ordinary sedan, modified with components that appeared deceptively simple. Yet beneath that unassuming exterior lay innovations that 3 independent laboratories would later verify as genuine breakthroughs. The vehicle achieved performance metrics that established automakers dismissed as impossible, traveling distances on minimal energy input that violated every efficiency calculation in existence. Word of Marlowe's achievement spread through underground networks of inventors and alternative energy enthusiasts, eventually reaching ears connected to power structures with vested interests in maintaining the status quo. The moment his invention transitioned from eccentric hobby to existential threat against petroleum dependency, Marlowe transformed from unknown tinkerer to targeted individual.
As forças alinhadas contra ele comandavam recursos beyond a imaginação, influência que penetrava governos, agências, e vontade de empregar métodos que sociedade civilizada recusa a reconhecer existem. Esta história follow a meticulosamente documentada jornada de um visionário que sua criação prometia a liberação de fossil fuel bondage e a sistemática campanha para enxergar que liberação nunca materializou. Comente abaixo de qual cidade você está assistindo a este vídeo para eu saber até onde a nossa história chegou.
Jonathan Marlowe's journey toward revolutionary discovery began in the most ordinary circumstances imaginable. Born in 1954 in a small Colorado town, he displayed mechanical aptitude before he could properly read, dismantling his father's radio at age 6 and reassembling it with improvements that baffled the local repair shop.
His childhood bedroom resembled a miniature laboratory filled with experiments ranging from crude battery designs to early attempts at wireless energy transmission. Teachers recognized his exceptional abilities and encouraged his parents to seek advanced educational opportunities that their modest means could barely afford. Marlowe earned scholarships that carried him through engineering programs at prestigious universities, graduating at the top of his class while simultaneously completing groundbreaking research that attracted defense industry attention. By 25, he held positions at aerospace companies working on classified projects whose nature remains hidden behind national security designations to this day. Colleagues from that era describe a man consumed by curiosity, someone who asked questions others feared to voice, and pursued answers through unconventional methodologies. His security files, portions of which were later obtained through Freedom of Information requests, reveal an employee considered both invaluable and problematic. Marlowe repeatedly challenged established protocols, proposed alternatives to accepted engineering solutions, and demonstrated uncomfortable willingness to point out inefficiencies that embarrassed senior management. Despite friction with authority, his contributions proved too significant to ignore, earning promotions and access to increasingly sensitive projects. During his tenure at various defense contractors, Marlowe encountered technologies that the public would not learn about for years, sometimes decades.
He witnessed electromagnetic research that contradicted public understanding, energy conversion experiments that suggested possibilities far beyond commercial applications, and propulsion concepts that made contemporary transportation look primitive. These exposures planted seeds that would eventually germinate into his revolutionary vehicle concept. In 1989, corporate restructuring eliminated Marlowe's position, offering him a generous severance package contingent upon silence regarding his work. He signed the required agreements, accepted the money, and retreated to Arizona, where he purchased a modest home with an oversized garage that would become his personal laboratory. Friends noticed changes in his demeanor, an intensity that bordered on obsession, a withdrawal from social activities that had previously brought him joy. Marlowe was processing years of accumulated knowledge, synthesizing classified concepts with his own theoretical innovations, working towards something he refused to discuss with anyone. The breakthrough arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday evening in March 1991. Marlowe had been experimenting with electromagnetic field configurations, attempting to achieve efficiency improvements in standard electric motor designs. Previous attempts had yielded incremental gains, nothing revolutionary, nothing worth sacrificing sleep and social connections to pursue. That night, however, a miscalculation produced unexpected results that stopped Marlowe mid-motion, his hand frozen above the control panel as instruments displayed readings that should have been impossible. Rather than dismissing the anomaly as measurement error, Marlowe possessed sufficient expertise to recognize when equipment functioned correctly and when phenomena defied explanation. He spent the following 6 hours replicating the conditions, verifying results, and documenting everything with the meticulous attention that his aerospace training had instilled.
By dawn, he understood that accidental discovery had revealed principles with implications extending far beyond his garage laboratory. The fundamental concept involved electromagnetic field interactions that created propulsive force through mechanisms not adequately described in published physics literature. Marlowe theorized that certain field geometries produced effects analogous to those observed in highly classified research he had encountered during his defense industry years, effects that official science denied existing. His notebooks from this period, later recovered and authenticated by multiple experts, show mathematical derivations that several physicists described as either brilliant innovation or elaborate fantasy. The distinction between those interpretations would determine Marlowe's fate. Over the following months, Marlowe refined his discovery, building increasingly sophisticated apparatus that demonstrated practical applications. The transition from laboratory curiosity to vehicle propulsion required overcoming engineering challenges that would have defeated less determined inventors. Materials needed fabrication from scratch, control systems required custom programming, and safety considerations demanded caution that conflicted with Marlowe's impatience to prove his concept viable. Financial pressures mounted as his savings depleted, forcing difficult choices between continuing research and maintaining basic living standards. Yet Marlowe persisted, selling possessions, borrowing from reluctant family members, and eventually attracting attention from individuals who would later prove instrumental in both advancing and endangering his work. The first outsiders to witness his prototype in operation were 3 fellow inventors from an alternative energy network that Marlowe had quietly joined seeking technical advice. Their reaction upon seeing the vehicle perform combined astonishment with fear.
understanding that such technology would attract unwanted attention from powerful interests. They urged caution, secrecy, and strategic planning before any public disclosure. Marlowe listened, but could not contain his excitement, making phone calls and sending correspondence that would eventually prove catastrophic. Someone in those networks was not who they claimed to be, and information about Marlowe's achievements began flowing toward destinations he never intended. The countdown to confrontation had begun, though Marlowe remained blissfully unaware that forces vastly more powerful than one Arizona inventor were already mobilizing against everything he had created.
The demonstration that changed everything occurred on September 14, 1994, when Marlowe invited a carefully selected group to witness his prototype's capabilities. The gathering included 3 university physicists, 2 automotive engineers, an independent journalist, and 4 investors whose financial support had kept the project alive during difficult months. Marlowe had transformed his garage into a presentation space, complete with monitoring equipment, safety barriers, and documentation materials that would allow attendees to verify the technology's authenticity. The vehicle itself looked unassuming, a modified 1988 sedan with subtle exterior modifications that gave no indication of the revolutionary technology contained within. Marlowe explained his propulsion system's principles using language accessible to non-specialists while providing technical details sufficient to satisfy the scientists present. His presentation lasted 90 minutes, covering theoretical foundations, engineering implementation, efficiency measurements, and potential applications extending far beyond personal transportation. The attendees asked probing questions that Marlowe answered with confidence born from years of obsessive refinement. Several expressed skepticism, demanding practical demonstration rather than theoretical explanation. Marlowe smiled, having anticipated this response and prepared accordingly. He invited the group outside where a measured track had been established on adjoining property purchased specifically for testing purposes. The vehicle started silently, without the familiar combustion engine sounds that normally accompany automotive operation. Marlowe drove the first circuit slowly, allowing observers to position themselves at various points along the track, to listen, to watch, to attempt detection of any deception.
Subsequent circuits increased in speed, demonstrating acceleration capabilities that matched conventional vehicles while maintaining the eerie silence that distinguished his propulsion system. After 12 complete circuits covering significant distance, Marlowe stopped the vehicle and invited inspection. The physicists examined power systems, searched for hidden fuel sources, and checked temperatures that would indicate conventional combustion. They found nothing that explained the performance they had witnessed using accepted scientific principles. One professor, whose credentials included decades of energy research, admitted he could not account for what he had observed without accepting premises his training had taught him to reject. The investors recognized commercial implications immediately, their excitement barely contained as they discussed potential market valuations and industry disruption. They saw not merely an innovative vehicle, but the foundation for transforming global energy infrastructure, a technology worth hundreds of billions if properly developed and marketed. Their enthusiasm would prove double-edged, attracting resources necessary for advancement while simultaneously drawing attention from competitors with vast capabilities for suppression. The journalist present that day was Miranda Chen, an investigative reporter whose previous work had exposed corporate malfeasance in various industries. She approached Marlowe after the demonstration, expressing interest in documenting his story while warning that publication would guarantee powerful enemies. Chen had witnessed enough industrial suppression during her career to understand patterns that naive inventors often missed: the initial dismissal, followed by acquisition attempts, followed by increasingly aggressive tactics when targets proved uncooperative.
Marlowe listened to her warnings, but remained optimistic, believing that documented evidence and public awareness would protect against the threats she described. He granted Chen exclusive access to his project, providing materials that would later prove essential in reconstructing events following his disappearance. The weeks after that demonstration brought rapid developments, both promising and ominous. Investment commitments materialized, totaling nearly $4 million that would fund facility expansion, additional prototypes, and preliminary patent applications. Simultaneously, inquiries began arriving from sources Marlowe could not identify: requests for technical information, meeting proposals from unspecified corporate interests, and surveillance signs that experienced observers would have recognized immediately. Marlowe's background had not prepared him for intelligence operations, leaving him vulnerable to methodologies perfected over decades. His phone records from this period show conversations with individuals whose names traced to shell companies and false identities, people who extracted information through sophisticated social engineering while offering nothing genuine in return. Marlowe believed he was networking, building relationships that would advance his technology toward commercial reality. In truth, he was mapping his own vulnerabilities for adversaries who would exploit every weakness he revealed. The first direct threat arrived in November 1994, delivered through intermediaries whose connections to petroleum interests would later be documented in court proceedings. An attorney representing unnamed clients requested a meeting, which Marlowe accepted, expecting legitimate business discussion. Instead, he received an offer to purchase his technology for $20 million, contingent upon his complete withdrawal from further development and agreement to never discuss his work publicly.
The amount was substantial, life-changing for someone who had struggled financially throughout his research years. However, the conditions revealed intentions that Marlowe found unacceptable. His technology purchased not for development, but for burial. He rejected the offer, a decision that escalated conflict towards its eventual violent conclusion. The attorney's response carried implicit threats disguised as concern, warnings about regulatory obstacles, liability exposure, and personal safety risks associated with challenging established industries. Marlowe interpreted these statements as intimidation tactics of desperate opponents, failing to recognize them as predictive announcements of actions already being planned. His optimism, which had sustained him through years of solitary research, now blinded him to dangers that more cynical observers would have taken seriously. Chen attempted intervention, presenting Marlowe with historical examples of inventors who had faced similar suppression and suffered devastating consequences. She showed him documentation of patent acquisitions followed by technology burial, careers destroyed through manufactured scandals, and deaths officially attributed to accidents that defied statistical probability. Marlowe acknowledged these patterns intellectually, but could not accept their application to his own situation, convinced that his precautions and documentation would provide protection his predecessors had lacked. This confidence would prove tragically misplaced, but understanding why requires examining the full scope of forces mobilizing against him.
The intelligence apparatus that targeted Jonathan Marlowe operated through mechanisms most citizens cannot imagine existing in democratic societies. Following his rejection of the acquisition offer, surveillance intensified dramatically, employing technologies and methodologies typically reserved for national security threats rather than civilian inventors. His home was breached during a brief absence, sophisticated monitoring equipment installed in locations that standard security sweeps would never detect. His communications were intercepted through cooperation between private interests and government agencies whose boundaries had become indistinguishable. Financial records were accessed, social connections mapped, and psychological profiles developed that identified pressure points for potential exploitation. This infrastructure existed because Marlowe's technology threatened interests extending far beyond any single corporation. The petroleum industry represents merely the visible portion of an economic ecosystem encompassing banking, transportation, manufacturing, and geopolitical power structures that depend upon controlled energy scarcity. Revolutionary propulsion technology endangered not just oil company profits, but the entire architecture of global commerce built upon fossil fuel dependency. Nations whose influence derives from energy resources faced existential threats from technology that promised to make those resources obsolete. The convergence of these interests created opposition far more formidable than Marlowe ever comprehended. Documents later obtained through various legal proceedings reveal coordination between corporate security divisions, private intelligence contractors, and government officials, whose regulatory authority could be weaponized against uncooperative innovators. This network had successfully suppressed previous breakthrough technologies, employing strategies refined through decades of experience that left minimal traces and provided plausible deniability for all participants. Marlowe represented merely their latest target, though his particular combination of credibility and documentation made him more dangerous than typical suppression subjects. The psychological campaign began subtly, designed to destabilize without creating evidence of external interference. Marlowe's relationships deteriorated as rumors circulated questioning his mental stability, his professional competence, and his personal character.
Investment commitments wavered as anonymous tips reached financial backers suggesting fraudulent representations. Regulatory agencies initiated inquiries based upon complaints whose origins could not be traced, consuming time and resources that diverted attention from technology development. Each attack individually seemed explicable through normal competitive dynamics, but their cumulative effect systematically dismantled the support structure Marlowe required for progress. Physical intimidation escalated in early 1995, beginning with incidents ambiguous enough to permit self-doubt. Marlowe's vehicle was struck in a parking lot, the perpetrator fleeing before identification was possible. His home was burglarized, with nothing stolen except notebooks containing technical specifications that he had fortunately duplicated elsewhere. Threatening messages arrived through channels that could not be traced, warning of consequences for continued work, while never specifying sources or demands clearly enough to constitute prosecutable crimes. These experiences transformed Marlowe's demeanor, replacing optimistic enthusiasm with paranoid vigilance that his opponents weaponized against him.
Medical professionals were recruited to document Marlowe's declining mental state, creating records that would later support narratives portraying him as delusional rather than threatened. A psychiatrist who treated him during this period later admitted under oath that his initial referral came through channels connected to pharmaceutical companies with petroleum industry ties, though he claimed ignorance of this connection when accepting the patient. The treatment protocols recommended medications that impaired cognitive function, which Marlowe fortunately rejected after experiencing adverse effects. Had he continued those prescriptions, his ability to maintain and demonstrate his technology would have been permanently compromised. Miranda Chen continued documenting these developments, accumulating evidence that revealed patterns invisible to those experiencing individual incidents in isolation. Her investigations traced connections between seemingly unrelated actors, demonstrating coordination that belied official denials of any organized campaign against Marlowe. She shared her findings cautiously, aware that publication would accelerate whatever timeline his opponents were following, while potentially providing protection through public awareness. The decision about when and how to publish became a source of tension between journalist and subject, with Marlowe urging immediate disclosure while Chen advocated strategic patience. Meanwhile, Marlowe's technical work continued despite obstacles, driven by recognition that his prototype represented his strongest defense against suppression. A functioning demonstration vehicle provided evidence that no amount of reputation destruction could completely neutralize. He focused obsessively on refinement, improving efficiency, enhancing reliability, and documenting every modification with thoroughness that would allow reconstruction even if his original systems were destroyed.
This documentation, distributed across multiple secure locations, would prove essential in preserving knowledge that powerful interests wanted permanently erased. The investors who had initially committed support gradually withdrew, their enthusiasm replaced by concerns that anonymous sources had carefully cultivated. Only 2 original backers remained by mid-1995, individuals whose personal conviction outweighed financial calculations and whose courage history has not adequately recognized. They provided resources sufficient to maintain operations, while Marlowe sought alternative funding from sources outside traditional financial networks. These efforts attracted attention from technology activists and alternative energy advocates whose communities had long suspected suppression of breakthrough innovations. A network of supporters began forming around Marlowe, providing not just financial assistance, but security measures, legal consultation, and communication channels that operated outside monitoring systems his opponents controlled. This network would preserve his legacy, even as events accelerated toward their devastating conclusion. The confrontation between Marlowe and his adversaries had entered a terminal phase, though neither side fully recognized the boundaries of acceptable action the other was prepared to cross.
The vehicle that would become Exhibit 1 in the most significant suppression case never publicly prosecuted received its final demonstration on January 8, 1996. Marlowe had invited witnesses whose credibility would withstand anticipated challenges, including 2 university department chairs, a retired federal judge, a documentary filmmaker, and representatives from 3 international automotive manufacturers who had expressed preliminary interest despite American competitors' hostility. The demonstration protocol was designed specifically to eliminate conventional explanations, incorporating monitoring by independent technicians, fuel system verification, and performance measurements that established benchmarks impossible through any known propulsion technology. Snow covered the ground that January morning, conditions that Marlowe had chosen deliberately because his system's performance remained unaffected by weather variables that impacted both conventional and electric vehicles. Observers watched as the prototype operated continuously for 6 hours, traveling distances that would have exhausted any battery system then in existence, while consuming minimal energy input. Technical readings were recorded simultaneously by 3 independent monitoring systems, eliminating the possibility that instrumentation had been manipulated. Every measurement confirmed what Marlowe had claimed since his 1991 discovery, that his propulsion system achieves efficiencies violating established thermodynamic limitations through mechanisms that mainstream physics refused to acknowledge. The retired judge, Harrison Wells, later provided sworn testimony describing what he witnessed that day, testimony that would be suppressed through court orders citing national security concerns, despite no apparent connection to classified information.
Wells described a vehicle that operated silently, accelerated smoothly, and demonstrated capabilities that his engineering-educated mind could not reconcile with any conventional explanation. He examined the vehicle personally, confirming the absence of fuel storage, combustion residue, or hidden power sources that might explain the observed performance. His conclusion, documented in an affidavit that still exists despite official attempts at destruction, stated unequivocally that he had witnessed technology decades beyond current commercial capabilities. The automotive representatives present requested private meetings with Marlowe to discuss licensing arrangements, their interest genuine despite corporate hierarchies that would later disavow any contact. Internal memoranda from these companies, subsequently leaked by conscientious employees, reveal that Marlowe's demonstration was taken seriously at the highest levels, generating urgent discussions about strategic responses to technology that threatened existing business models. The consensus that emerged from these discussions favored acquisition and suppression over adaptation, a decision that aligned these corporations with petroleum interests in opposition to their public stated commitments to innovation. Documentary footage from that January demonstration survives through channels that have never been publicly revealed, preserved by individuals who understood its historical significance and the lengths authorities would go to ensure its destruction. This footage shows not just the vehicle's performance, but Marlowe himself, articulate and confident, explaining principles that his audience struggled to comprehend but could not dismiss. Watching this footage today evokes profound tragedy, knowing that within weeks the man speaking would vanish and the vehicle he demonstrated would be seized by agencies whose authority over civilian technology remains legally questionable.
The immediate aftermath of the demonstration brought renewed pressure from multiple directions. Marlowe received another acquisition offer, this time for $50 million, delivered through attorneys whose client list included major petroleum companies and defense contractors. The conditions remained similar to previous offers, complete withdrawal and silence, though additional provisions required destruction of all documentation and agreement to psychiatric evaluation that would establish official narratives of mental instability. Marlowe rejected this offer as decisively as he had rejected its predecessors, though his communication now carried exhaustion rather than the confident optimism that had characterized earlier responses. He recognized that escalation was inevitable, but refused to abandon technology that he believed humanity needed. Legal attacks intensified, with patent applications challenged through procedures that typically processed in months, suddenly requiring years of review. Regulatory investigations expanded, now including examination of financial transactions with implications of fraud that Marlowe's meticulous records easily refuted, but required significant resources to address. His remaining investors faced similar scrutiny, their business interests threatened through mechanisms unconnected to Marlowe except through their support for his work. The message was clear enough that even committed backers faced pressure to withdraw, leaving Marlowe increasingly isolated with adversaries whose resources seem unlimited. Chen's investigation had reached conclusions that she believed warranted immediate publication, despite risks that disclosure might accelerate rather than deter further action against Marlowe. Her evidence documented coordination between corporate, governmental, and private intelligence actors that constituted criminal conspiracy by any reasonable legal interpretation.
However, publication through conventional channels would require editorial approval from organizations vulnerable to advertising pressure and access restrictions that these same actors could impose. She began exploring alternative distribution methods, while Marlowe continued refining his technology, both unaware that events were about to render their preparations irrelevant. The date was February 3, 1996, and Jonathan Marlowe had exactly 19 days left before disappearing from documented existence.
The final documented sighting of Jonathan Marlowe occurred on February 22, 1996, at approximately 7:30 in the evening. A neighbor observed him returning home, carrying groceries, behaving normally with no indication of distress or unusual circumstances. Marlowe entered his residence, and after that moment, no verified witness ever saw him again. The groceries were later found partially unpacked, suggesting interruption during routine domestic activity. His vehicle remained in the garage. His wallet, containing cash and identification, sat on the kitchen counter. His phone records show no outgoing calls after that evening, though incoming calls continued unanswered for several days before concerned associates raised alarms. The investigation that followed exemplified everything wrong with official responses to cases involving powerful interests. Police initially treated Marlowe's absence as voluntary departure, noting that single males sometimes abandoned responsibilities without explanation. His history of unconventional beliefs and reported mental health concerns, carefully documented through psychiatric contacts his opponents had engineered, provided convenient explanation for investigators unwilling to pursue uncomfortable directions. Only after sustained pressure from Chen and others did authorities conduct even cursory examination of his home, finding no signs of struggle but also no evidence supporting voluntary departure. The timeline that investigators eventually reconstructed, partially through records obtained over subsequent years, suggests professional operation with minimal physical force. Marlowe was likely approached shortly after entering his home, probably by individuals he was expecting or had reason to trust. The absence of defensive wounds or property disturbance indicates either willing cooperation or incapacitation before resistance became possible.
His destination remains unknown, though subsequent evidence suggests transfer to a facility far from Arizona, possibly outside American borders, where interrogation occurred without legal oversight or accountability. The vehicle and all associated documentation were seized within hours of authorities determining that Marlowe was missing rather than merely temporarily absent. The seizure order bore signatures from agencies whose jurisdiction over civilian technology had no established legal foundation, citing national security authorities that could not be challenged in civilian courts. Everything Marlowe had created, every prototype component, every notebook, every computer file, was systematically removed from his property and from secondary locations where he had established backups. The thoroughness of this confiscation suggested foreknowledge of his documentation practices, information accessible only through surveillance he had never detected. Chen's material survived because she had taken precautions that Marlowe never imagined necessary. Her documentation was distributed across international locations, held by individuals without obvious connection to her investigations, encrypted using methods that contemporary computational power could not defeat. When agents approached her seeking cooperation, she provided nothing beyond published articles that contained carefully limited information. Her refusal to assist generated consequences that included career destruction, financial investigation, and surveillance that continued for over a decade. Yet she preserved the evidence that allows this story to be told today, a preservation that required courage few possess. The official investigation concluded without resolution, classifying Marlowe's disappearance as an unsolved missing persons case that lacked evidence supporting criminal charges against any identified individual.
This conclusion satisfied legal requirements while ignoring evidence that pointed toward conclusions threatening to powerful institutions. Family members who attempted to pursue private investigation encountered obstacles suggesting coordinated interference, from attorneys who withdrew from cases without explanation, to private investigators whose reports contradicted observable facts. The message conveyed through these obstructions was unmistakable, even without explicit communication. Several individuals with knowledge of Marlowe's situation experienced consequences that reinforced silence. One physicist who had authenticated his technology died in a single-vehicle accident 6 months after the disappearance, toxicology revealing substances inconsistent with his documented lifestyle. An investor who had refused to withdraw support faced business reversals that bankrupted enterprises previously considered stable. A technician who had helped construct the prototype developed sudden illness requiring hospitalization, during which his residence was burglarized, with only items related to Marlowe's technology stolen. Patterns emerge from these isolated incidents that suggest anything but coincidence. The technology itself was never seen again by any documented witness. Speculation ranges from complete destruction to classified development for military applications to ongoing suppression pending circumstances favorable to controlled release. Evidence supporting each theory exists without conclusive demonstration of any single explanation. What remains certain is that propulsion technology, proven viable in 1996, has not appeared in commercial applications nearly 3 decades later, while automotive transportation remains dependent upon principles unchanged since the early 20th century. This outcome benefits interests that have grown vastly more wealthy during intervening years, while humanity continues paying costs that revolutionary technology promised to eliminate.
The question that haunts this story is not what happened to Jonathan Marlowe, but why society permits such things to continue happening. The suppression of breakthrough technology serves narrow interests while harming billions who remain trapped in energy dependency that enriches the few at everyone else's expense. We know this pattern exists because examples accumulate across decades, across technologies, across industries where innovation threatens established profit structures. Yet public awareness has not generated institutional reforms capable of preventing repetition. The legal framework theoretically protects inventors, but provides no practical recourse against adversaries with unlimited resources and governmental connections. Patent systems designed to encourage innovation instead become weapons against independent developers who lack ability to defend against coordinated challenges. Regulatory agencies intended to serve public interests are captured by industries they supposedly oversee, becoming instruments of suppression rather than protection. Law enforcement defers to powerful interests when investigations might reveal uncomfortable truths, preferring unsolved mysteries to resolutions requiring confrontation with forces that can destroy careers. Technology development has consolidated within corporate structures whose incentives favor controlled, incremental progress over revolutionary breakthroughs that might render existing investments obsolete. Independent inventors working outside these structures face obstacles so comprehensive that survival requires either concealment or surrender. The rare individuals who achieve visibility despite these barriers become examples whose fates discourage others from following similar paths. This systemic suppression produces outcomes indistinguishable from those that would emerge if explicit conspiracy coordinated every action, though individual actors may believe they serve legitimate purposes.
Miranda Chen spent remaining years of her career documenting suppression patterns across multiple industries, connecting incidents that authorities insisted were unrelated into narratives revealing systematic obstruction of progress benefiting humanity. Her work influenced subsequent investigators who have expanded understanding of mechanisms through which innovation gets controlled, directed, and, when necessary, eliminated. She died in 2019, her final interview expressing hope that accumulated evidence would eventually reach critical mass sufficient to generate reform. That hope remains unrealized, though communities preserving her documentation continue efforts that may eventually achieve what she could not accomplish alone. The physical evidence of Marlowe's achievement exists somewhere, either preserved in classified archives or destroyed by those who considered its existence intolerable. Sufficient documentation survived through distributed preservation efforts that reconstruction would be possible if institutional barriers were removed. Engineers who have reviewed available materials confirm that the principles Marlowe described are consistent with theoretical frameworks increasingly accepted by physicists willing to challenge orthodox limitations. His innovation anticipated developments that mainstream science only recently began approaching through conventional research pathways. Vindication may arrive decades too late to benefit the man who sacrificed everything for technology that threatened to liberate humanity from artificial scarcity. We are left with lessons that should guide future action but probably will not, given humanity's demonstrated inability to learn from historical patterns. Independent inventors must understand that breakthrough technology attracts opposition proportional to its disruptive potential, and survival requires precautions that may seem paranoid until they prove essential.
Documentation must be distributed across jurisdictions, encrypted against seizure, and entrusted to networks that will preserve knowledge even if individual members face consequences. Public visibility provides some protection, but also attracts attention that accelerates opposition timelines. Strategic calculation regarding disclosure timing may determine whether innovation reaches implementation or joins the growing archive of suppressed possibilities. The automobile you drove today operates on principles little changed from vehicles a century ago, burning fuel extracted from finite reserves through processes that damage environmental systems upon which civilization depends. Alternative technologies have existed for decades, suppressed or delayed through mechanisms this story has attempted to illuminate. Your continued dependence on obsolete transportation enriches interests that have demonstrated willingness to destroy individuals threatening their dominance. Every dollar spent on gasoline subsidizes suppression infrastructure that guarantees similar technologies will face similar opposition in the future. This cycle continues until public awareness generates political will sufficient to reform institutions that currently serve narrow interests over collective welfare. Jonathan Marlowe believed that demonstrating viable technology would be sufficient to overcome opposition. His fate proved that belief tragically wrong. Changing this dynamic requires action extending far beyond individual invention, demanding collective recognition that current systems serve suppression and must be fundamentally restructured to serve innovation instead. Whether humanity possesses capacity for such recognition remains the question upon which everything depends. Tell me in the comments what you think happened to Marlowe, and tell me from which city you are watching this video so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world.